Okay, good evening. Um, this is John Bushka. There's a picture of a undersized ping pong table like what we had in the house I grew up in. It certainly gave me home field advantage when I played ping pong with friends back in the 1950s and early 60s. Um, that's at Merrifield, Virginia, at the Mosaic near the Angelica Theater. And these are some pictures of that's the First Baptist Church of the city of Washington, D.C. until 1954. And as a child, I went there, and this is the building as it was built in 1955. For about 8 months, we went to the Jewish Community Center up 16th Street for service. And then the pastor, Edward Hughes Pruden, that was pastor at the time, wrote these two books. And let's go to just there's a picture of the building from the outside, and there's a picture indoors, and there's the baptistry. And I was baptized with my mother in late January of 1956, and the building opened Christmas Day of 1955. So let's get to what I want to talk about, which is hookup culture mainly in heterosexual young men. And if I were 30 years old as a gay man, that's a pretty strange thing for me to talk about. I'm out of my element, right? If I was 30 years old, though, with HIV having come under control, although that could be deceptive, we still got to worry about it. Be careful about it with making sure about our behavior and making sure that PrEP remains available, um, remains reasonably priced, or get to a generic version of it or something. That's another topic. But um, the whole idea of courtship leading to marriage and consummation, wedding night, and children seems to have been falling apart for the past 15 years or so. And I just wanted to tell a little story. I was in the early part of 1971. I had actually lost my first job at RCA and went to work for the Navy Department as a computer programmer. I'd been in the Army. That's a tried employer. A friend got me a job there in early 1971, and I met this very charismatic um, young man who was very intellectual and sort of mega conscious, and very, very much into math, and we palled around together. And he was on his third wife already, I think, as I remember. But I got very attached to him. But to sort of break the attachment, which is another thing, um, I decided it was time for me to start dating girls myself. In the later part of 1971, when I was 28, I dated one young woman. Let's call her Sophia. That's the temptress and Gnostic thought. I'm not going to use her real name. I'll call her Sophia for the purposes of this. And um, I remember when I went to pick her up for the first date in early September, her father had a sandwich for me because I was very skinny at the time. And I didn't want to eat because I was going to take her out to dinner. That didn't make any sense, but I was kind of flattered by that. In Silver Spring, I'd driven over from Northern Virginia, and we went places. We went to hear the premiere of Leonard Bernstein's Mass at Kennedy Center, and went to some interesting dinner things. Went to the Singles Club. Almost went to the Washington Senators' last baseball game in 1971 when they were sold from under us. And um, we had a lot of interesting time together. But then I sort of stopped calling, sort of stopped right around Christmas time. And then in 1972, which is why I showed you the picture, we had the Nixon and China thing happen. The ping pong diplomacy, the whole ping pong diplomacy story, which you may have heard about. That ought to become a movie, by the way. Maybe it will, because I know something about that. But um, on February 27th, the pastor at the time had a big reception in his home in suburban Maryland with a lot of people so we could watch the Nixon and China stuff. And as I recall, Sophia was there, and I wondered whether to speak to her or not. And I never did. I didn't speak to her at the engagement. There were about 100 people there because I was already beginning to realize that if I continued dating, and there was one other girl I had dated too, but if I continued dating, um, I might not be able to consummate the marriage. I was starting to even feel aware of that. And so I didn't actually talk to her that night. But the whole thing was in those days, this is still the early 70s, if you're a man, you become the provider, you court have courtship with a young woman, and you get married, and then you consummate, and then you have children, and you spend the rest of your life in um, till death do us part in a family bed, and intimate for the rest of your life. And I was an only child. I had always had my own room by myself, my own twin bed by myself. I mean, even that was, sort of challenging, the contemplation. So I didn't say anything. So this is a case where no information was information, a little bit of quantum entanglement. Um, but then 2 months later, at the end of April, we had a search for meetings, Sunday school. Well, it was on a Sunday afternoon with the assistant pastor, Reverend Sanks. I still remember his name. And Sophia was there, and she sort of broke down and cried about being in a box. And I don't know if it had anything to do with me or not. But then the next day, the pastor gave a sermon, or the next Sunday about um, the rich young ruler and attachments to material things, but not only that, but somehow he got to the point of discussing, also attachments to people that are unhealthy, upward affiliation, um, cherry picking, that kind of thing that's unhealthy. And but he then got around to talking about how a mother's love is for a child simply because the child exists, where a father's love is because of what the child potentially can become. But of course, you have to be fortunate, Well, sometimes that doesn't always work out. You have to deal with disability and anything as a parent. But the becoming a parent in those days gave you the right to public agency, gave you justification for entering public life. And um, I sort of never resumed dating. Had a couple of interesting trips and experiences. Went to the strip mines and with a roommate, and then that's a story. A short story in my third book, um, and then went to Europe for 16 days, and then changed jobs to Univac. And when I moved to New Jersey, then my life started changing, and in early 1973, I came out after going to a talk. That was a very monumental day, and my life changed. And I've told that story before. Um, but um, one of the things this kind of brings me back then, to hookup, towards the subject of hookup culture. Um, because today I'm from young men that I have social contact with and online, particularly online. Um, Dating women is really difficult. And most of the time, in many cases, young men are expecting to score on the first date. Sometimes young men are having so little opportunity, they don't know if they don't, I think a lot of young men don't know if they'd be able to consummate a marriage if they had to wait with the way we were supposed to. I think that's frankly, is a problem that nobody talks about. That's the gist I get from a couple of cases. I know about a few cases of I know about a case of someone with a pregnancy who went to a party and where everybody was playing around and very ritualized and got a girl pregnant, and that became turned into a personal trial for that person. And I also know of another case where someone, and these are people that have been on YouTube. I won't name them or anything, but the stories are really challenging. Someone who was dating, giving a young man advice on how to date and how to score, but also how to be a more assertive person and so forth, and would had a strategy for dating a girl on the first night, taking even a consent video and he thought he was being very careful to get consent. And he wound up in one particular case, he wound up being accused by the girl, probably falsely, of violating her consent. And he wound up going to prison, apparently for 3 years in Canada. And I, you know, it and this it seems like this hookup culture is very, very dangerous and very, very risky. It's ruining young men's lives, but young women. It's so difficult for them to find women, and the idea of dating someone for a long time and courting them and being able to provide for them, and then waiting till wedding night to consummate. I think some young men, again, as I said, probably don't know if they'd be able to do that. I was beginning to think I wouldn't be able to do that. And nobody talks about it that way, but I think that may be one reason for hookups culture and trying to score the first time to make sure you can. I think that's going on from stuff I hear people say. And so I thought this was time for a very frank discussion from an elder gay man. And I'm not, it's not something I'm directly exposed to, but it has affected people I know, and actually have interaction with and so forth. So this is the risk that you can take, whether it's pregnancy on the one hand, and whether you can take the responsibility of that, where that leads, or the consent issue is another issue. Those are two of the biggest issues with this culture, and it's just all over the place online. So I just wanted to talk about it tonight. Again, for me, it would have been being used to having someone sharing your bed for the rest of your life when you've been alone in bed. But most young people have probably grown up with siblings and have been used to sharing not beds, but bedrooms, been sharing bedrooms, not having the privacy that I had when I was growing up. But for me, it would have even been more challenging for that reason. Even though when I was growing up, I knew of other only children comparable to me, and a couple of them that I knew had got married successfully and did just fine with their marriages back from the 1950s. In those days, uh, people were serious about courtship and marriage, and they talked to me about it on that Science Honor Society field trip to Mount Washington, New Hampshire in 1961. That was before I went to William and Mary. And then to some extent, when I got to William and Mary, we all know my story, there were a lot of men were talked like they were very worried, a little bit worried about what would happen when they met women. A lot of them were worried about it, which my presence in the dorm apparently made them even more worried. But that's another part of my story. But I just thought I would talk about that tonight, that the hookup culture, and sometimes in some of these court cases, trials, the judges have been very harsh about that. But young men, with the economy and AI and women being very independent and outperforming them academically and getting the jobs, women not needing men to support them, and the low birth rates, the low fertility rates, or not replacing the population, all these kinds of things could lead to an extreme crisis, social crisis. The birth rate, the low birth rate is still another issue. So I just thought I would talk about this tonight a little bit. It is very alarming. And just to ponder this a little bit, the cultural problem of what's happened to young men and the way they can meet and form families. It's getting very difficult to form families at all. So I thought I would just talk about that. And I do thank you for listening.